What's up, everybody? Welcome into the Bears Illustrated podcast. Garrett and Pranay here. And man, we have a lot to talk about here on today's episode. We're going to dive into some women's college basketball as well as March Madness. And then we're going to get into some of this coaching carousel. Pranay, we talked the other day a little bit when Jerome Tang came out and made the noise going from Baylor to Kansas State. But we'll take a deeper dive into that. But let's talk women's basketball. And I was thinking today about the job Nicki Collen had done this season, an inaugural season. You obviously are in a position where you're following up a legend, one of the greatest to ever do it. And there's obviously some obstacles you had to overcome, but you get the team to the postseason. You were able to maintain the roster as far as turnover goes when you start the season. For the most part, you had a couple of transfers. But when you look at this, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about the job of Nicki Collen this season?
Well, I'll say there's two things that come to mind. One is the midseason turnaround that Nicki Collen helped this team have, because they started out pretty shaky, lost 2 non-conference games, which was, I think that was the first time since like 2010 that happened. And then they started out 1-2 in conference play, and it looked like Nicki Collen might not be the coach that Baylor was gonna be riding with for the future. And then it just completely turned around. They only lost one more conference game the rest of the season, and even that was on a last second shot to Oklahoma. And then in the first truly big game of Nicki Collen's coaching career, the Bears came out and absolutely dominated Iowa State to clinch the Big 12 regular season championship. So that showed that she can coach in big games and that she can get the team ready for big moments. But then, unfortunately, the next 2 big games, the Big 12 tournament final and the second round game against South Dakota in March Madness, the team didn't come out looking good. Especially in March Madness, they came out flat. The offense was shaky, and there's some questions as to, well, she's going to have to prove that she can coach in tournaments down the road.
Yeah, for me, I think that was the biggest thing, right? You're hosting the tournament on your court. The expectations are this is a team who should easily make it out of the field of 32 and make it into the Sweet 16. You take care of Hawaii, and then you draw the South Dakota State team who, they were playing really well, but they completely took Baylor out of their game. NaLyssa Smith was essentially non-existent in that ball game, which is really uncharacteristic after all the accolades she had, all year long. But it was almost as if the team was just deflated after the barrage of points and just the competitiveness of that first half. It was almost like their leaders checked out and were saying, you know what? I'm already on to my next step. And that was a bad look for me. When you go back and you check out that post-game press conference, extremely awkward. The SIDs having to run over and bring tissues. You can't really answer questions. A lot of crying. It was kind of a weird scenario that unfolded, but I don't think that necessarily is indicative of the season as a whole. I think it's one of those things where you kind of got to put this behind you and go forward. But was there any concern for you and how it ended like that?
Yeah, there was some concern for me because that's 2 games now in the postseason where Baylor came out. The Texas game wasn't nearly as bad. Texas is a much better team, and Baylor didn't play bad. Texas just played better. This game, you're supposed to win this game. You're significantly more talented. And basically it came down to Baylor couldn't hit 3, so they started doubling NaLyssa Smith, and then she couldn't really get anything going. I think that does come down to coaching. So Nicki Collen is going to have to improve as an in-game coach, it looks like. But I do think that she will improve, and it seems like she's the type of coach who can get a team to play together and to play for a purpose. It just didn't happen in the NCAA tournament.
No, that's very true. And I think, for me, one of the biggest things when all of this season was getting underway, really the transition in general, was how many players is she going to be able to keep on this roster? You're able to hold on to Moon Urson, Queen Egbo, Nalissa Smith, and you got Caitlin Bickle to buy in, as well as Sarah Andrews. Unfortunately, immediately, Hannah Gusters hits the portal. She heads to LSU. Trinity Oliver heads to Washington. But I think even bringing back that nucleus was really important for laying the foundation, because it showed that she had the respect of leaders on the team. And I think that it took a while for the transition and the message and to be received and everything, for them to start playing with Nicki's identity compared to what they had been used to. But overall, I think that was really crucial for her to be able to do that. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. It was definitely very important. Keeping Nalissa Smith and Queen Egbo especially. Moon Urson did head to LSU, but we kept those players. We kept Jaden Owens. And that's something that's gonna be important maybe for recruiting, because that'll show that these players believed in her even before she had coached a game at Baylor. And maybe that shows that she's the type of personality that can get recruits to come to Baylor, just like Kim Mulkey was. But we'll see what happens down the line with recruiting, because it's going to be very important to keep getting those 4 or 5-star recruits, as well as to use the transfer portal and bring in some grad transfers. Because this year they were playing with 8 players after Hannah Gusters transferred, so it was very difficult. That might also have played into why the team struggled down the line.
Oh, no doubt. And that's what makes me wonder, when you look at this season, is this offseason going to be more important than last year? Because you've already got, Queen Egbo comes out yesterday and announces that she's entering the WNBA draft. We all know Nalissa's gone. I'm not sure about the rest of the roster, what she's going to be able to retain. But for me, how do you approach recruiting? Because now there's a lot more parity in women's college basketball. You're seeing more and more great head coaches come up and get their own little recruiting trail and their paths and their niches that they know they're going to do. And now Nicki's in a position where you're recruiting up against Kim Mulkey. You're recruiting up against all these other coaches. So I feel like this offseason is more important than last year's. And you make up a good point with the transfer portal. Would you compare what she's looking at doing with the recruiting traditionally as going after these high school kids and these all-star McDonald's All-Americans and everything? Would you like to see a balance in those recruits compared to the transfer portal, or do you think that you need to bring in a handful of both?
I'd like to see most players come from high school, getting just normal recruits, but also bring in maybe 2 or 3 grad transfers or upperclassmen transfers to help mentor the younger players. Because as we get these older players leaving, like Nalissa Smith and Queen Egbo, there aren't as many mentors for the potential recruits that'll come in. And I think that's very important. And also to stay competitive, it's much easier to stay competitive with upperclassmen than it is with freshmen.
That's true. Looking at this right now, so they were 28-7 this season, 15-3 in conference play, but you're swept by Oklahoma. And you look at last year, what they were able to do. They were 28-3, 17-1, lost that grueling heartbreaker to UConn in the Elite Eight. Overall, do you think this was a success? And to go along with that, you got to, whether we like it or it's fair or not, everything that this regime under Coach Collen does is going to be joined at the hip with what Kim Mulkey does at LSU.
That's very true. It definitely will be. And LSU also went out second round of the NCAA tournament. So when you look at it like that, you have to consider it a success, because the team won the Big 12 again. And under a new head coach, it could be a lot worse. You could have easily gone, 500 in conference and not done as well. But when you win your 12th straight Big 12 championship and then get to the Big 12 tournament final and earn a 2 seed in the NCAA tournament, that's still a successful season, especially for a first-year head coach with a shorthanded roster.
Very true, man. And from one section of coaching changes to another, we've already talked about it. Jerome Tang's out the door. He's headed to K-State. There's been a bunch of other moves across the landscape of college basketball on the men's side. We're going to dive into that next here in segment 2. You're listening to the Bears Illustrated podcast.